To life, l'chaim. I am Chana Tina Duskus. I am Reb Zalman's youngest child from his first marriage. I am a certified saging facilitator, and this is Saging International's second presentation on the life of Reb Zalman, part of a three-part series. The first episode was the story of the 18+1 miracles on the Schachter's family escape from the Nazis. Today's episode, number 2, will focus on the years 1941, the arrival in New York, through the 60s. We call these years the years of the wanderings and the wonderings. And to help us, we have here Rabbi Or Rose, who's a dear family friend and a student of Reb Zalman. So Or, please introduce yourself.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be with you, Chana Tina, and to be with the saging community again. As you said, I had the privilege of being a lifelong student of Reb Zalman's because my parents were his students and friends, and they had the good fortune of knowing you as a child and many of your siblings. At this point in my life, as a rabbi, as a scholar, much of my work, in fact, is focused on Reb Zalman's evolution. And so I'm thrilled to be with you and participating in this retrospective, a retrospective that I hope and pray will not only be about the past, but will help all of us, as I think Reb Zalman would want it to be, to think about the present and the future. So to you, I want to say, Yishar Kochech. Undertaking this project is a big deal, personally and professionally, and you're gifting us with so much rich material. So may you go from strength to strength, and I am here with you, enjoying the fruits of your labor.
Thank you so much, Reb Or. I really appreciate what you have to say. So we're going to be talking about Reb Zalman's middle years of wandering and wondering. So here's a question for today's second episode. What happens when a creative, clever teenager raised in an ancient spiritual culture, while also exposed to the best secular wisdom of his day, first faces his own death at least 18 times before turning 20, but survives emotionally and physically intact? Second, discovers during that experience that human nature is capable of both profound evil and profound courage and compassion. And then, as a young adult, further discovers there is also great wisdom in other spiritual traditions besides his own. What might that young person be capable of becoming when he is committed to fearlessly searching for truth while also staying rooted in the ancient wisdom of his tradition? Well, we're about to find out. As we finished our episode number 1, the Schachter family had finally arrived in New York after 3 years of fleeing the Nazi Holocaust. Their oldest child, my father, Zalman Schachter, was a teenager of 16 years old. They left Nazi-occupied Vienna in 1938 as a family of parents and 4 children. They narrowly evaded capture over a dozen times, escaping Hitler's death camps thanks to many human angels who came to their rescue. That was the first of many turning points in young Zalman's life. The dangerous journey taught him how to live by his wits, imagination, and creativity, and to entrust himself to Hashem, a larger-than-life spiritual presence. Hashem in Hebrew is the name of God, meaning the name. The Schachter family's final stop in Europe was Marseille, France, where they waited for visas to immigrate to the United States. With time on their hands, Zalman and other Jewish young men met to talk about their hopes, their culture, and their faith. They had little opportunity to continue their learning while on the run. A local shul had a rabbi who gave talks on Jewish history, prayer, and ritual. Zalman asked him to help the group of friends continue their Torah learning, and his teaching resonated with Zalman. Then one day, the teacher had to be away, so he called in a substitute, a young, bright, scholarly teacher whose ideas astonished young Zalman and made him want to hear more. Let's listen to a short clip of an older Reb Zalman describing what changed for him that day and influenced the rest of his life.
Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who was the last of the Lubavitcher Rebbe's. Being young, having studied in Paris, and being very learned, and he came to be with us and he gave us a talk. And again, that was such a heart and eye opener for me, because it made me understand something. You know, every religion wants to claim that the snapshot of their prophet, messenger, lasts for all time. It doesn't last for all time. So many people would want to say that the right kind of Judaism has been with us all the way from Mount Sinai on. And the conditions through which our tradition has traveled in between, they don't take this into consideration. And it was at that session that he opened up a portion for us of the Talmud that speaks that there are different eras. And in each different era, there's another mindset. I heard this and began to realize that if I looked at our history this way, developmentally, it led me to the notion of paradigm shift. Just the same way as people talk that in science there have been paradigm shifts. One of them, for instance, the earth is in the center and the sun runs around it. And then no, the sun is in the center and the earth runs around it. So that's a paradigm shift. It shifted from one point of looking at reality to another point. And then we saw Earth from outer space. And at that point, you can't hold on to that anymore. Because Earth is alive, people came to the Gaia hypothesis, and there's a much different understanding about how religions fit together. And so this got me to a whole lot different understanding of how to deal with Judaism, paradigm shift.
Though young Zalman didn't learn the name of the substitute teacher whose message gripped him that day in France, Zalman's teenage mind was captured with an exciting new way to see the world. My father never forgot that day, nor the rabbi who inspired him, but whose name he did not know yet. Only later, after arriving in New York, did Reb Zalman learn the rabbi's name, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, a Polish Jew like himself, who was also bound for New York. Finally, the Schachter family's visas came through, just in the nick of time. They got help from the U.S. consul in Marseille, Hiram Bingham IV. With Bingham's support, they boarded the SS Ipanema, a French cargo ship that was bound first to Africa and then on to the Virgin Islands. Then shortly after the Schachter family embarked on their journey, the Nazis captured Marseille and rounded up all the Jews who were left behind, taking them to the concentration camps to be exterminated. they barely escaped. Safely aboard the ship, and foreseeing more challenges ahead, Zalman found a book in the ship's library on the English language. During the months at sea, he studied English and excelled at it, and became the family's American interpreter. The Schachters continued on to Puerto Rico, and in another amazing coincidence, it seemed miraculous, Zalman found them last-minute passage to New York on a luxury liner. They arrived at the U.S. Immigration Office at Ellis Island within sight of the Statue of Liberty, one day before Passover, 1941. They were greeted by a distant cousin, Herman Youngley, who became their immigration sponsor. Herman was a successful businessman. He owned a Manhattan radio station and had many influential friends. He took the Schachters to HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which provided care to the Jewish refugees. So on the first day in America, the Schachters celebrated the full Passover festival with wine and matzah, the supreme Jewish ritual of freedom and deliverance. They were overwhelmed with a sense of blessing and gratitude. The family had no more than $50 left. Though they had no wealth in their pocket, they were free and had the hope for the future. But it was now necessary to start totally over again. All of them were in a state of trauma, and Zalman's father, Shlomo, was still in his midlife at 43 years old. Shlomo wanted his children to get a good Jewish education, but America was new, and he was cautious about sending his children to public schools. New York had many Jewish schools for boys, but only 2 that admitted girls, one in Manhattan, the Ramaz School, and the other in Brooklyn called the Shalama School for Girls. They decided to settle in Brooklyn near the girls' school because there were many more boys' yeshivas to choose from. Shlomo took a map and put a pin in Shalama's school. He drew a circle around the area, and within that circle, they would find a place to rent. Meanwhile, young Zalman, age 16, was eager to continue his studies with the rabbi whom he had met in France. He had learned the man's name and looked up his father-in-law's Brooklyn address. His name was Menachem Mendel Schneerson, son-in-law of the great rabbinical scholar, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. The senior Rebbe Schneerson was based way across town from the Schachters' new apartment in Brooklyn at 770 Eastern Parkway. One day, Zalman tried to walk the 10-mile trek across the urban maze of Brooklyn to the Rebbe's office. Zalman got lost. The distance tired him out, and he returned home. But Zalman was never a quitter. He tried again, but he was smarter the second time and took the subway. Rebounding from disappointment was always a characteristic of my father, who loved to learn and grow. But now, how would a penniless immigrant boy get to see a world-famous Rebbe? The Gabbai, the Rebbe's receptionist, reacted. Who does he think he is? He wants to see the Rebbe? Very nice. He can want. The Gabbai told young Zalman, you are not a Chassid, which is a member of the Jewish sect. You don't look like a Chassid. You're not dressed like a Chassid. You don't speak like a Chassid. I'm sorry, but the Rebbe doesn't just see anybody. But even young as he was, Zalman was creative and persistent and never backed down. He made up an audacious excuse. I have brought the Rebbe regards from his son-in-law in France. The Gabbai went into the Rebbe and said, there's a young whippersnapper outside who says he brings greetings from your son-in-law. The Rebbe replied, bring him in. Tell me, so new, how did you meet my son-in-law? The Rebbe asked. Zalman gave a quick synopsis of the class that he attended in France. But after a bit, the Rebbe stopped him. Are you sure that he said that? Doesn't sound like something he would say. Perhaps you meant this. Zalman was always clever, but he also knew his boundaries. He admitted the Rebbe was right. Yes, my mistake. That's exactly what your son-in-law said. Despite the poor start, the two of them hit it off that day and connected deeply. In the end, the Rebbe invited Zalman to study at the Jewish Rabbinical Seminary at 770, even though he had no money to pay for it. In Hebrew, it's called a Beit Midrash, or house of study. Was the Rebbe intrigued by Zalman's feisty enthusiasm, his imagination, his chutzpah? Could any of those things be? We'll never know. But it was the transformational meeting that day that shaped young Zalman's whole future. We should mention that the Rebbe was the world leader of Chabad Lubavitch, a strain of Hasidic Judaism. It was an 18th century Polish revival movement grounded in the ancient Judaic texts, rituals, dance, and mysticism. In the coming post years, this Lubavitcher movement reached out to rebuild traditional Orthodox Judaism, and Zalman became a part of that. Meanwhile, Zalman's father, Shlomo Schachter, applied for U.S. residency and found an apartment in Brooklyn near the school. It was a corner storefront with a synagogue on the first 2 floors. A large piece of the ceiling was cut away to connect the first 2 floors with the balcony. The Schachters got the 3rd floor above that. Back in Vienna, Shlomo had run a textile and apparel business, so he set up a one-room workshop at home where he could work with fabrics and furs. Young Zalman had already picked up his family skill set, and now knowing some English, he quickly found an outside job at a factory running industrial sewing machines. For a while, Zalman, age 16, brought in the family's only income. One day, mother, Chaya Gita, went to register the 2 little girls at the Shalom school, about 4 blocks walk from their new apartment. But it didn't go well. Shalom school had a limited enrollment, and sadly, they were full. Furthermore, the young Schachter children didn't know English. With a raised eyebrow, the principal said that she thought first they ought to go to public school for at least a few months to learn English, and then come back if there might be any room for them. Chaya Gita came home in an awful mood. Zalman got home from work that day to find his mother very upset and in a bad attitude. He asked her, "What's the matter?" She told him the bad news. But Zalman was always a networker and a schmoozer, and he replied, "Don't give up. I'll go to talk to the Rebbe and see what he can do." Next evening, Zalman came home from work and told his mother to go back to school the next day and try again. "I am not going back there," Chaya Gita grumbled. "They threw me out." But Zalman replied, "I took the subway and talked to the Rebbe today, and he said you should go." Imagine Chaya Gita's surprise when the principal invited her in and said frankly, "I know we will have a difficult task ahead, but there's no way I can refuse the Rebbe. So please bring your children to start school tomorrow." So the 2 youngest started kindergarten together, but another blessed coincidence. Their teacher spoke French and could include the girls in their studies immediately. And more, the first grade teacher spoke German. So during recess, the 2 teachers took extra time and taught the Schachter girls their English ABCs. Imagine that. Another huge blessing, like the Schachters had experienced so often during their flight from the Nazis. And this time, it was thanks to Zalman's confident persistence. In fact, on that same trip by Zalman, the Rebbe said he would help the Schachter family get set up in the fur business. Fur was a popular but pricey fashion accessory for women in the 1940s and 50s. Equipped with the Rebbe's business contacts, Zalman was now able to bring his skills home from the factory to the workroom in their apartment. Working with pelt furs and scraps was difficult. Fur was a luxury product that took much craftsmanship. Full coats cost between $250 and $600. And that was 1941, which equals about $5,000 to $20,000 today with inflation. Huge sums, especially during wartime. But Zalman, only 17, was adept with his hands and his mind, and the family business quickly became a success. Already we can see young Zalman was curious about everything, both the crafts of the hand and things of the mind. He was a very quick learner at English, at sewing, and he had a passion for theology books. So less than a year Zalman announced that he would be stepping back from full-time work at the first shop to enter the Lubavitch Yeshiva, or seminary, to become a rabbi. While proud of his ambition, his father, Shlomo, was not totally happy about this. Shlomo had hoped that as father and son, they might work together to build up a business. But Zalman had a vision of his own and was determined to follow it. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States finally entered the war. Disturbing news trickled in from Poland. All the Jews in the Schachter's hometown of Ushpizim had been deported by the Nazis. Word was that their friends and relatives who stayed behind were probably dead. They eventually learned that Shlomo was the only one of 7 siblings to survive the Holocaust. Try to imagine how this affected the adults. They were relieved to have survived with the children, but also struck with profound grief, a sense of loneliness, loss, and deep sorrow. Shlomo turned inward and never again spoke about his birth family. The children were largely oblivious to all of this. They were busy with their new adventures, learning English and acclimating to America. Zalman and his brother Yossi often accompanied Shlomo to government offices to fill out forms. The boys learned English while Shlomo was still struggling with it. Very typical of immigrant families where children tend to pick up new languages faster than adults. The younger they are, the quicker they seem to learn. But the dreadful news from home created major stress for the grown-ups. Just one example. Their apartment had an old refrigerator. And one night, son Yossi woke up choking, smelled gas, and ran to tell his parents. Immediately, Shlomo had a frightful, traumatic flashback, remembering the poison gas attacks in Europe. In shock, he threw open all the windows and then realized that the gas was only from the refrigerator. Yes, the 3-year wartime stint of constant anxiety and worry had left its mark, which is probably why in the winter of 1942, soon after Pearl Harbor, Shlomo, age 44, suffered a mild heart attack. Fortunately, he was not hospitalized, but he still needed bed rest. That summer of 1942, for his health, Shlomo took the 3 younger kids by train north to visit their Uncle Yankel and his family, who had escaped to Canada and became farmers. The trip was meant for Shlomo to relax with a change of scenery, but for the kids, it was great fun. They enjoyed farm life and time with their cousins and family. Bit by bit, the business improved. The summer of 1944, as the war drew down in Europe, while still going on in the Pacific, the Schachters moved from their synagogue apartment to a storefront on Brooklyn's 20th Street. They opened a retail store on the ground floor with their workshop behind it and several part-time employees, and 2 apartments upstairs. They made fur coats from start to finish, and most of them for salons in Manhattan. But in crowded New York City, the polluted atmosphere, Chaya Gita suffered from asthma. Her doctor prescribed Asthmador cigarettes, which had an even worse odor than regular cigarettes. And how ironic. She had insisted that her husband quit smoking, and now she herself had to smoke. During this period, Shlomo also came down with serious pneumonia, made worse by his heart condition. Luckily, the new wonder drug, penicillin, had been developed by the Nobel Prize-winning scientists, Alexander Fleming and Howard Florey. The Pfizer company raced to build the world's first penicillin manufacturing plant to save the soldiers' lives during the war. And, of all places, in Brooklyn. The Schachters surely saw posters just like this on their streets in their neighborhood. Soon, penicillin was available not just for the troops, but also to the public. And thanks to it, Shlomo recovered, though, of course, he was weak. Unfortunately, Zalman was no longer available to work full-time. He had begun his rabbinical studies at 770 Eastern Parkway and was commuting to class by subway. So even though the Schachters were now safe in America, they faced new tensions and anxieties. While slowly recovering, both Schachter parents got medical advice to leave smoggy New York and move to a dry, clear climate for their health. So in the summer of 1946, just as the war was ending, the rest of the Schachters, other than Zalman, all relocated to Phoenix, Arizona. By then, Zalman was 21 years old. He moved into the dorm at 770 Eastern Parkway, and his job there was to lock the doors at night and opening them in the morning, while he continued his theology classes. Now let's follow the rest of the Schachter family for just a bit for their move west. Then we'll come back to New York and focus on Zalman. They sold the storefront in Brooklyn and most of the machinery, and they moved household goods to Arizona. Phoenix was then a sleepy desert town, about 50,000 people, nothing like the sprawling metropolis of 5 million people today. They bought a typical ranch-style home and set up a textile workshop in the garage. The climate was great, but they missed the Jewish community of New York. There was only one small synagogue holding services in a renovated church building, and it was too small to pay a rabbi, and there was no Jewish school. Shlomo quickly stepped in as a lay leader for the prayer service, and the 3 kids had to attend public school for the first year. But this was not good enough. So during the summer of 1947, Shlomo arranged for Devorah to go back to Brooklyn to attend Beis Yaakov Seminary for Girls, and brother Yossi was sent to Yeshiva University High School. The kids traveled by train to New York. Fortunately, Zalman lived nearby in his dorm, and he assumed responsibility. Setting up a new family business out west was a challenge, and needless to say, fur coats were not in great demand in the hot desert of Arizona. Fortunately, the Schachters had know-how to work with all kinds of textile, so Shlomo adapted and did contract work for makers of trousers and military apparel. He explored the prospects in California, which also had good weather, along with a booming economy. They relocated to Los Angeles in 1949, where they began selling textiles wholesale, using contacts back in New York. They also set up a men's necktie factory. That summer, son Yossi completed high school and a year of college in Brooklyn, and he came to help them in LA. Cars were nearly impossible to get during the war, but they found a used car, an old 1938 Hudson. Yossi got his driver's license. He tried to teach his father how to drive, but it took a while. The 2 short fused Schachters had more than a few hot conversations about it. Yossi tried selling men's neckties wholesale, but he was not a success. Sales were not for him. Then exciting news arrived. The state of Israel had just proclaimed in May of 1948, the first time Jews had had a country of their own in over 2,000 years. Like other idealistic young men, Yossi dreamt of making Aliyah, immigrating to Israel. But the Middle East was in turmoil, and Shlomo did not want any son of his going into a hot war zone. The family had barely escaped the Nazis and were still grieving the wartime deaths of Shlomo's whole family and most of their old friends and neighbors. So Shlomo refused to finance a trip for Yossi to the new war zone. Instead, in August of 1950, Shlomo arranged for Yossi to go east instead for more college classes at Yeshiva University's Chicago campus. Shlomo and Chaya Gita saw success in their business. They'd been putting aside their first $10 of income each day and now invested that savings in a Los Angeles apartment building where they lived themselves. So the Schachters became landlords. They had more work to do, but also more security. They became mainstays in their local synagogue, first at one congregation and then another. Now back in New York, we find Zalman coming into his own as a young adult, beginning his years of wanderings and wonderings. The war was drawing down. Soldiers and sailors were coming home, getting married and getting settled, and Zalman did the same. On March 11th of 1945, as the tide of war in Europe was turning, with the Allied troops crossing the Rhine and entering Germany, Zalman married a Jewish school teacher, Fagel Resnick. Both of them were seriously committed to Chabad. Faye taught first grade in the first Chabad girls' school. She created a curriculum that taught 6-year-olds how to read Hebrew in just 6 weeks. She was an ideal wife for a young traditional rabbi. They remained a couple for 23 years and raised 5 of us children together. At that time, Rebbe Schneerson began establishing schools outside of New York City to serve the many young post-war Jewish families of the baby boom. The Rebbe stressed modern educational theories. His teachers would not just teach rote memorizing facts, but also get to know their students, their character traits, and answer their questions. Still a student himself, Zalman was sent to assist at one of these new shuls in the commuter suburb. Then in the summer of 1945, when Zalman was 21, he got his first post as rabbi's assistant in New Haven, Connecticut, near Yale University. He recruited Jewish boys into day school for some and after-school programs for others. Zalman began to inquire about new ideas in Jungian psychology and youth development. One of the new book table at the New Haven Public Library, Zalman discovered the Portable World Bible, an anthology of sacred writings from major world religions. He also picked up Difficulties in Mental Prayer by Eugene Boland, a Catholic monk from Ireland. These were 2 early post-war ecumenical interfaith books, and here Zalman was awakened to the realization that other religions, besides for Judaism, also had some real wisdom to offer and taught effective methods for drawing closer to God. 2 years later, in 1947, Zalman got his second professional post in Rochester, New York. He was the Hebrew school principal and also classroom teacher, fundraiser, bus driver, and janitor. He had 20 kindergarten students and 20 after-school students, with just 1 part-time employee. Being a Jewish community through recruitment and fundraising during lean economic times was challenging. There was no money for heat, and soon the bank foreclosed on this building. He rented a storefront space for a while, but the handwriting was on the wall. This new school would not last. To provide for his young family, Zalman needed a side job, so he began learning kosher butchering and became certified. And in no time, he realized that was not going to be a favorite profession for him. Then in 1948, the Rebbe called in Zalman and another student, Shlomo Karlebach. The 2 men had known each other since childhood in Vienna. The Rebbe sent the 2 young men out to do research on college campuses, along with their other work. Their first assignment was at Boston and Brandeis universities, and over the next 6 years, the 2 of them teamed up and traveled to meet Jewish students on many campuses. After that, they went their separate ways, but their friendship proved to be lifelong. They developed a rich partnership working with young people. Shlomo's career blossomed, both as a songwriter and as a performer of Jewish traditional and contemporary music. At first from his base in New York, and later, Zalman and Shlomo, still working as a team, launched the first 2 so-called hippie synagogues, both in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. The House of Love and Prayer was founded in the late 60s by Rabbi Shlomo in San Francisco. Later, in 1975, Reb Zalman was between his assignment in Winnipeg and his new work in Philadelphia. He taught for 1 semester in the Bay Area and launched what became the Aquarian Minyan in Berkeley, a congregation that's still quite active today, celebrating their 50th Jubilee this summer. Shlomo later became known as the Singing Rabbi. He was one of the first inductees into the Jewish Music Hall of Fame in 2022. Nearly 100 synagogue communities around the world centered their worship on his musical style today. Zalman, however, focused on traditional campus outreach, or kiruv in Hebrew, through the Jewish organization called Hillel. Zalman first connected with Hillel when working at Boston University, and it became his dream to become a Hillel rabbi. Zalman was a great fit on campus, where he launched all sorts of creative promotions and activities to reach young Jewish adults. 2 years later, Zalman spotted an ad in Yiddish in a newspaper. A synagogue in Fall River, Massachusetts, 50 miles south of Boston, wanted a rabbi and a teacher. He applied and was hired for his very first pulpit job. Joyfully, he soon got his U.S. citizen's papers. To keep in contact with his New York friends, Zalman bought a ham radio and got a license to operate it. Zalman loved new technology, so he was always in his element when computers came out. And Skype was one of his favorites. In fact, during the last decade of his life, we enjoyed a Skype call with him almost every Sunday. But his salary in Fall River was not enough to make ends meet for a growing family. So once again, Zalman supplemented his income by working at a kosher slaughterhouse in nearby Providence, Rhode Island. He didn't enjoy the obscene talk of his fellow chicken pluckers, but he was never one to criticize. Zalman always taught by attraction, never by wagging a finger of guilt. One day he started to sing a spiritual, Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. And do you know what? They all joined in, and soon they were singing hymns and pop songs while plucking chicken feathers, making the slaughterhouse environment holier. The crew dubbed Zalman their bebop rabbi, and the nickname stayed. After 4 years in Fall River, Zalman found a better paying post in 1953 as the rabbi of historic Ahavat Achim Orthodox Synagogue in nearby New Bedford, Massachusetts. Zalman's dream was still to become a Hillel campus rabbi, but first he needed a master's degree. He negotiated with his New Bedford synagogue board to allow him time each week for graduate study. He was actually going for his PhD. In 1955, he enrolled in pastoral counseling classes in his beloved Boston University, commuting 60 miles north each week. He had to catch a train at 5 a.m. for a 2-hour trip to Boston, and he got there just in time for morning prayers and for breakfast before his 8 a.m. class. The only campus building that was open that early was the Marsh Chapel. The main chapel is cavernous and was huge wooden statues of Jesus and the 4 evangelists, not an ideal place for a Jewish morning prayer. So Zalman explored downstairs and found a smaller chapel, but it had a cross on the altar, which was also distracting. So Zalman found a small storage room to say his morning prayers. One day, an African-American man walked in and asked Zalman why he was praying there and not in the chapel. Thinking that the quiet, unassuming stranger was perhaps a janitor, Zalman mumbled something about the decorations not being suitable for Jews. The black man said, "Why don't you stop in tomorrow and see if you feel more comfortable?" Curious, Zalman checked the downstairs chapel the next morning, and the cross had been taken down, replaced by a burning candle, and on the lectern was a Bible open to Psalm 139:7, which reads, "Where shall I flee from thy presence?" After saying his prayers there, Zalman put the cross back in place as a gesture of respect, and to return the favor, he turned the Bible to Psalm 100, a Thanksgiving psalm. It reads, "Enter God's gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and bless his name." Soon thereafter, a new course was announced on the inner spiritual growth, offered by Professor Howard Thurman, the new professor of spiritual discipline and the dean of Marsh Chapel. The title intrigued Zalman, and it offered labs for experiential thoughts, meditation, and sharing. But Zalman wasn't sure if he would be welcome, so he went to meet the new dean. Could he trust this new professor not to try to convert him to Christianity? Surprise! As Zalman entered the dean's office, there was the very same African-American man who he had earlier mistaken for a custodian. It was Dr. Thurman, the first African-American professor at Boston University, who would teach there for another 12 years. Zalman explained his hesitancy as a Jew at taking a Christian course, saying, "I'm not sure if my anchor chains are long enough." Dean Thurman was silent for a time. He took his hands and was looking back and forth, and then quietly asked Zalman, "Don't you trust the Ruach HaKadosh?" Which means the Holy One in Hebrew. Zalman was shocked to be answered in his own mother tongue. Confused, he stood up and left without even a thank you or goodbye. But then in the end, Zalman came back and took the class. He not only learned a great deal that he later incorporated into his own teaching, but it was the beginning of a close, long-lasting relationship with Dean Thurman. In time, Howard Thurman became one of the towering wisdom leaders of the U.S. civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was also a grad student at Boston just then, and Dean Thurman was also his advisor. Dr. King, later, liberation teaching, and Zalman, too, were both inspired by Dr. Thurman's lectures on the Hebrew prophets and his openness to Gandhi and the Quaker concept of nonviolence. We have to wonder, did Zalman and Dr. King ever meet there as students? Did they get acquainted? It's quite possible. By the end of the academic year, Reb Zalman was lovingly referring to Thurman as his Black Rebbe. He later claimed that Howard Thurman redrew my reality map. Here was the first non-Jewish religious figure Zalman would come to admire, a person of color whose intellectual and pastoral skills Zalman would seek to emulate. As we will soon see, Zalman evolved into a global spiritual leader himself, with many interfaith colleagues and friends. But it all started there, with morning prayers at the BU Chapel. What Zalman found most transformative was Thurman's use of breakout sessions, where students were told to discuss and actually experiment with various embodied spiritual practices that they were learning about in the lecture hall. This included song and chant, breath work and movement, drama, meditation, and art forms. Dean Thurman had learned to use these spiritual practices himself when he studied Quakerism with Rufus Jones in Philadelphia. And Rufus Jones, in turn, had learned them from Mahatma Gandhi and Buddhism on the visits that he made often to India. So anyone familiar with Reb Zalman's teachings later will see the chain of events here. Howard Thurman, the Quakers, Gandhi, and Buddhism all influenced Zalman Schachter there in Boston and thereafter. They thus also influenced the later Saging movement and Aleph as well. I see this as a second major turning point in Reb Zalman's life when he opened up to global spirituality in a way that was utterly new for Jews. Just as an aside, let me also mention that later, Zalman invited Dean Thurman to Winnipeg to speak to his Hillel students there and to attend one of my brother's bar mitzvahs. At Zalman's special request, Thurman spoke a bar mitzvah blessing in Hebrew for my brother that day, another sign of the influence that Howard Thurman had not just on the U.S. civil rights movement, but also on Zalman's underlying ideas for saging and Aleph worldwide. Meanwhile, our family was growing. When I was born, I was honored to receive a personal letter of blessing from the Chabad Rebbe back in Brooklyn. While in New Bedford, my father faced turmoil in his synagogue. Only 15% of the members were actually Orthodox Jews. Most of them would have preferred a Reform congregation, but there was none in New Bedford. And the conservative synagogue, they charged very high dues. So in order to pray in a synagogue, many Reform folks came to Ahavat Achim. They sat in the back rows and they complained about the traditional conservative style. My father encouraged these visitors to pray the traditional way that men pray, with ritual tefillin straps as stipulated in the book of Deuteronomy. But the men there resisted the ancient tradition, believing it to be outdated. My father felt they simply didn't know how to use the tefillin and were just embarrassed, or so he thought. Zalman joined a local interfaith ministerial association and got to know Christian pastors and learned how they make pastoral calls in members' homes for prayer, teaching, pastoral care, and counseling. He was also learning about this in his degree program in Boston. So he began visiting his members in the evenings after getting home from class, hoping to encourage them in traditional spiritual practices like posting a mezuzot on their posts and donning tefillin armbands for prayer. He even hoped to begin to use some English in worship and prayer. But as lay leaders took offense, they saw it as an invasion of their privacy and attempt to get them to change, something their longtime member families had no interest in doing. The board president wrote an antagonistic public letter, a strong signal that my father's time there was coming to an end. And eventually, the synagogue board refused to renew his contract. He ended up leaving New Bedford with hurt feelings on both sides. This conflict was the next great turning point in my father's life, something else that shaped his later life and work. More on that story, along with the story of another major turning point, the one that resulted in the saging movement, will be told in detail in our next episode on November the 7th, when we will get a broader view of Reb Zalman's accomplishment. For now, let's simply move on to the next chapter. That summer in 1955, Zalman attended the annual conference of Hillel campus directors as a guest speaker. And by the end of the week, he was brimming with enthusiasm. He had nearly finished his MA program of Psychology of Religion in Boston, and he was more than ready to move out of his congregational rabbi job, especially that one. But one thing he was not ready for was the dress code. To apply for a job in Hillel, he had to fit with the times in the mid-50s and to show up with a nearly clean-shaven face. Hillel had been founded in 1923 at the University of Illinois, and today it serves students on more than 850 campuses in 16 countries. Today, a beard would be no problem. Both rabbis and students wear beards today, but things were different back in the post-war 50s. Society was looking for clean chins on men. My father had embraced his identity as a traditional first full-bearded Chabadnik, so shaving his face for the interview was very difficult. My mother and all of his children gathered in the bathroom to watch as he cut his beard. He had tears streaming down his cheeks. It was so identity-bending for him. He did keep a small goatee that he sported for his Hillel interview in Washington, D.C., but after he got the job, as soon as he could, he grew back that full beard. Zalman was offered one of two Hillel positions, either in Winnipeg, Canada, or Gainesville, Florida. Both were vacant, and it was his choice. He picked Winnipeg because it had a solid Jewish community with elementary and high schools for the children. It also offered a position teaching Judaic studies at the University of Manitoba, and he later also taught pastoral counseling at the University of Winnipeg in their departments of religion. Zalman enjoyed teaching there for 20 years, serving students on both campuses. He also enjoyed mentoring assistants, including, especially, Neil Rose, who was his longtime assistant there and who succeeded him. If the surname Rose sounds familiar, it's, of course, the name of my workshop partner today, Rabbi Or Rose. Rabbi Neil was his father, so our two families have been close for years and still are. At this new job in Winnipeg, Zalman was instrumental in launching new ideas. The University of Winnipeg was private, founded by church people, Presbyterians, and Methodists. It was a liberal arts school offering theology and clergy training. Zalman brought with him cutting-edge teaching ideas that he'd learned in Boston, including using some kind of breakout groups and spirituality labs that Howard Thurman had discovered among the Quakers. Consequently, he started the Department and Clinic of Pastoral Psychology there for ecumenical students of all spiritual traditions. The program thrived while he was there, but it seemed not to have survived. Various academic reorganizations have happened since. However, in its day, it successfully trained many pastors, rabbis, and priests. The Shachters moved to Winnipeg in the summer of 1956 when I was just 16 months old. Our house is pictured here, located on a nice boulevard. We had many special times at the house, including weekly Shabbat celebrations, the Jewish holidays, and my three brothers' bar mitzvahs. We had lots of guests there, and some of them very well known, quite a variety of people. For example, in 1964, when I was 9 years old, I remember a special Passover at our house when my father invited a Catholic priest and 3 nuns as our guests. It filled the whole front of the house with many tables and 40 people. Winnipeg was better known as Winterpeg because of the sub-zero temperatures. To avoid having to walk to synagogue through the worst of the cold winds, my father set up a prayer room in our basement. We had many winter Sabbath services in our house. He put pillows on the floor and he burnt sweet incense before lighting the Shabbos candles. He got the family up for dancing and singing and had a basket full of kaleidoscopes for us kids to enjoy during their silent meditation. And it's interesting how these embodied spiritual practices later turned up at saging events and in Jewish renewal. I remember many mornings in the kitchen getting ready for school. My father would drink his coffee, and he got down near the bottom of the cup. He would add milk and sugar and make coffee milk just for me. I loved that. Too bad he didn't patent it. Now it's quite popular and makes a lot of money for some coffee shops. That's so typical of my father. He was not interested in making lots of money, but he was often far ahead of his time with lots of bright ideas that only came to be accepted and popular years later. Summers were always a huge adventure for our family. My father had his summers free from teaching and Hillel work, so he would do summer teaching gigs at camp and would take us with him. I remember camps in Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Wisconsin. At camp, my father would experiment with hands-on projects. He experimented with an early rainbow tallis or prayer shawl at Camp Ramah workshop, where he brought in bright colored remnants of fabrics, and he had sewing machines, and he was an expert at sewing. He had the campers create their own tallis. The rainbow tallit later became a kind of trademark for both Reb Zalman and the Jewish renewal movement. He also had campers make their own mezuzahs in arts and crafts. He instilled fun into the prayer service by singing traditional Hebrew songs to popular tunes like Jimmy Crack Corn. The children and adults all loved it in the camp environment. And of course, he later brought that kind of spiritual summer camp creativity to synagogues and Hillel meetings, and later into the elder community of the saging movement. The Schachter family eventually spread out across North America, but stayed in touch with one another. In 1966, we gathered for a family Passover reunion in Chicago that everyone attended other than my brother, Shalom, who was away studying. Next year, our family visited Montreal for the wedding of my Aunt Pepe's daughter, Leah, and also visited the Montreal Expo in 1967, the World's Fair. In later years, we traveled for many weddings, births, and funerals. After I was married, I lived in Atlanta for 17 years, and my father would come to visit on his way to his annual teaching commitment in Florida. He was a wonderful grandparent, giving each child special attention. He especially liked to fix and tinker with their bikes and toys while he visited. Our grandparents continued to live in Los Angeles, where they still had health problems. Finally, at the time of my father's move from Winnipeg to Philadelphia, my grandfather, Shlomo, became seriously ill and passed away. The family arranged for his body to be flown to Israel for burial, but his courage and love for us all will always be remembered as a blessing. My own first son carries his name, Shlomo. We lived at the Winnipeg house for 13 years until 1969, when I began high school and our parents divorced. After that, the 3 of us kids, still under the age of 18, stayed with our mother as she moved to an apartment across the street from my high school, while our father moved into his own apartment near the campus. While I later enrolled at the University of Manitoba, my mother moved us yet to another apartment near the campus. As parents, Zalman and Fagel both cared deeply about us children and centered their lives around what was best for us. During my father's 20 years with Hillel in Winnipeg, he related to Jewish students of all persuasion, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, whatever. He always liked to think of himself as post-denominational. Having gone to work with Hillel, he was no longer operating as a Chabad Lubavitch Chassid. Zalman stayed in contact with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, however, sending him reports on his activities and asking for guidance. Nevertheless,
The students he was working with and the environment were changing his perspective. In Winnipeg, my father began to transform both himself and his out into a new space beyond traditional Jewish orthodoxy. And oddly enough, it was a transformation that the Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson himself had inspired my father to begin with, way back on that turning point day when they met in France. Let's turn to that side of things now. Zalman's vision for his own transformation and renewal of Judaism began to take shape while he studied with Howard Thurman, but it matured and was first realized during his time in Winnipeg. Many things happened during those years, both on campus and also during my father's travel to conferences and a wide range of other spiritual leaders whom he met.
Now here to help us understand what these people meant to my father and how they helped with his transformation, I'm pleased to welcome a good friend of my father's, a confidant, colleague at the Naropa Institute, Netanel Miles Yipitz. Netanel is a very busy man. He teaches in the Department of Religious Studies at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. As an artist, Netanel creates paintings with traditional religious imagery reset into multicultural context. He has a number of books in print. Netanel and my father co-founded the Interfaith Inayati Maimuni order, which is committed to a path of spiritual development based on both Sufi and Hasidic practices. Netanel, welcome. Please tell us about my father's circle of holy friends.
Well, thank you for having me. It's such a joy to be talking to you and to have heard Reb Zalman talk over the years about various children and about you and now to meet you in person is wonderful. So, what can I tell you?
So today we're going to focus just on my father's midlife years in Winnipeg, and there are 4 groups of holy friends that we're going to pick up here. Experimental drug use, Roman Catholic monasticism, psychology and the science of the mind, and Sufi mysticism. So let's start with the experimental drugs like LSD, which my father explored cautiously as possible aids to spiritual enlightenment. This was maybe his most controversial move beyond Judaism. I think that what he did was greatly misunderstood, don't you think? Was he really the so-called hippie rabbi that his opponents labeled him to be?
I think the misunderstanding is that he was wildly experimental. And I don't think that is the case with anything that he did. He was wonderfully curious all the time. But his curiosity came in a conceptual matrix. Like he was very interested in what his students, because he was a college professor, his students are reporting on psychedelic experiences, and they mirror reports of mystical experiences. And that caused a great curiosity in him to know, is there a part of the mind that can be awakened or opened that, is similar, whether it's the use of psychedelics or the use of a kind of meditation, whether it's Hitbonenut meditation from the Chabad tradition, or whether it was LSD. And if it can, what do we need to know about that? What constraints do we need to honor? He was very curious that way. And so I don't think it was wild experimentation. His curiosity led him into these danger zones for other people.
So when did LSD become controversial and illegal?
I really don't know. I imagine it was controversial from the beginning. What I do know is that Reb Zalman first engaged it in 1963. I have a letter from him to Timothy Leary about a week or 2 after their experience together. And it was certainly controversial already because in that letter, Timothy Leary has just been fired from Harvard University. And your father is telling him, well, perhaps you can come live, near Manitoba. And so, that Leary is fired already means it's already being used in a way that has endangered a very famous professor's position.
I think it was 1968 that it was banned by federal law, but before then it was used for different experiments. During those years that my father developed relationships with Catholic contemplative monastic community and its peace movement, tell us about that if you could.
He often talked about this, period in his life as his Catholic period, which is, he's thinking of like Picasso's blue period, etc. Not that he ever became a Catholic or converted, but jokingly, and in truth, he had this profoundly deep dialogue, internal dialogue with Catholic contemplative Christianity. And in fact, he knew a great deal of literature from the Catholic contemplative tradition. And at a certain point, he began reading in it and began a dialogue with monks in Manitoba, outside of Manitoba, Trappist monks there, and began to spend time with them, and eventually came into a strong relationship with a very famous, perhaps the most famous Catholic monk of the time, Thomas Merton. And it was really a curiosity, again, the same kind of curiosity about what was being done on the other side of the fence that paralleled what he was doing within Judaism. He had come to understand that Catholics had a meditation tradition, which was very similar to the meditation tradition of Chabad Hasidism. And he wanted to know what that was about. And so that led him again into this dangerous territory and into friendships that expanded his thinking.
Well, I recall some of those friendships. I remember when I was 9 years old in 1964, we had for the very first time at our Seder, one monk and 3 nuns. It was quite a Seder. During the years of the Vietnam War, my father also developed relationships with the Catholic peace movement, which he sympathized with, particularly the Berrigan brothers. Do you know about Daniel and Philip?
Yes.
What can you tell us about them?
Mostly that he met them through Merton. And somewhat fortuitously, on one of his visits to Merton at the monastery at Gethsemane in Kentucky, on one of the visits, either Daniel or Philip Berrigan or both of them were at the monastery at the same time, which seems incredible to me. That, they're just coming together of these figures all at once. And he remembered that one of the Berrigan brothers was listening to, they were playing a recording in the monastery of Bishop Fulton Sheen, who was very, had a kind of happy-go-lucky message. Everything is good, everything is positive. And he was kind of grumbling, one of the Berrigans was, that everything is not so happy. Everything is not so good. We're actually at a very troubling time in America, back then. And they became very strong activists. And so I know that's how he met them. What relationship continued after that, I don't know, other than his own politics either were or became very, very progressive and activist oriented.
During those years, my father also spoke and taught a lot about the work of philosophers and psychotherapists who had taught about human knowing works. A favorite topic of his was paradigm shifts. One of Reb Zalman's favorite books was on the philosophy of science by Thomas Kuhn, a Jewish professor at Harvard, Berkeley, and MIT, who wrote the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962. What did Zalman learn from that?
I would say that he was onto this notion prior to that. I think Thomas Kuhn's language of paradigm shift just gave language to something that Reb Zalman had already intuited. In fact, he himself said that his first notion of paradigm shift actually went back to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe. No, I'm sorry, the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, who he met in Marseille prior to coming to the United States. And the Rebbe at that time gave a talk about the arc of Jewish history and turns within it, movements within it, where paradigms shifted. He didn't use that language, but that first gave Reb Zalman that notion that we go through shifts in consciousness and understanding, even within Judaism, that the Judaism of this period is not the Judaism of this period. And that's why he liked to talk about Yavna too, that we need a new Yavna where Judaism is reinterpreted. And so I think he was already onto this, and Kuhn just gives him the language of paradigm shift. But that was core to his understanding, and it's the true interpretation of Jewish renewal. When you use the word renewal in Judaism, what he meant was paradigm shift. He was trying to articulate an understanding of how Judaism evolves over time.
He also liked the philosopher Gerald Hurd, who wrote Five Ages of Man, later retitled The Five Ages of Humanity. What can you tell us about Gerald Hurd?
Gerald Hurd was a genius, and he's a little-known genius. Reb Zalman used to say that he was Ken Wilber before there was Ken Wilber, which was a comment to say that there's some people that have such a scope in terms of their understanding of science and religion and the arts, and all have it at their fingertips. And Gerald Hurd was that kind of person. And it was Gerald Hurd that told him to connect with Timothy Leary. Gerald Hurd was the kind of senior mentor of Aldous Huxley. He was Irish, and Reb Zalman sometimes called him my Irish Rebbe, again jokingly. But they did have a close relationship, and he even said that he had asked Gerald Hurd, he said, when it comes time for your passing, I would like to be there with you. And that didn't get to happen. But Gerald Hurd's work is quietly among the most significant influences on Reb Zalman's thought, especially the Five Ages of Man and a little work that you can barely find, Training for the Life of the Spirit. And they have a lot to do with evolution and paradigm shift, again, without those words. And so Gerald Hurd is perhaps even more responsible for Reb Zalman's understanding of paradigm shift. And an amazing person who wrote Mycroft Holmes novels and wrote fairy stories about evolution. Just an amazing person.
Wow, sounds amazing. I expect that the group of holy friends that you can tell us the most about would be my father's relationship with the Sufis, since that's your own spiritual tradition. Can you please share that with us?
Yeah. Well, Reb Zalman said, while he had profound contacts with people from all religions, whether it were Buddhists or Hindus, Christians, he said that he found himself most aligned spiritually with Sufis. And it's the only tradition in which he made a personal practice connection. And you have to make a distinction, because there's Sufism that could be called Islamic mysticism, coming out of the Islamic tradition. And Reb Zalman was certainly knowledgeable about that, but that was not quite the connection that he made. There's also Sufism that is considered universalist, meaning it comes out of the Islamic tradition, but then it became a tradition in itself with teachings and practices that could be applied whatever your base religion. And so Reb Zalman was never anything but Jewish and profoundly Jewish, and never anything but orthoprax, if not orthodox. So for him, he could never disturb that. But in his relationship with Universalist Sufism, he had adjunct teachings. And so he first met these Sufis in, I would say it's probably in the late 60s in the Bay Area. And the first Sufis he met were young students of Murshid Samuel Lewis, who was a Jewish Sufi teacher that died in 1971. And from there, Reb Zalman goes on through relationship to them to becoming a Sufi initiate himself. The Sufi master Pir Vilayat Inayat Khan makes him a sheikh. And from there, he begins to make connections with Islamic Sufis, some in Israel and some elsewhere. And it became a real interest in his life for the rest of his life.
Wow. Thank you so much, Nathaniel, for taking time from your very, very busy schedule to pay tribute to my father. We're very grateful for your wisdom. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for all that you've shared.
Well, you're welcome. It's such a joy to do this.
And it's nice to see you sitting in what was my father's office.
It's nice to be sitting in it. There's such a sense of continuity for me to now be in this office and to use it and continue what for him was a mission. He often used the language of being deployed by God. And that was what was most important to him, that we fulfill that mission and keep serving that desire. And when I sit in here and talk to you like this, I know that I'm continuing that deployment.
And I feel like this project has been a deployment to get this out. And I'm very grateful for everyone that's been helpful in putting in their experiences and their wisdoms into it. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
1968 was a transitional year for my father. It was his 8th year teaching in Winnipeg, so he was eligible for sabbatical. He spent most of that time back in Boston working on the remaining graduate courses for his doctorate. He also traveled to the San Francisco Bay Area. There, Zalman first met Pir Vilayat Khan, who became his great Sufi friend and mentor. During a Holy Man Jam event in Santa Rosa, where the Sufi choir was performing ecstatic dancing, Zalman and Pir Vilayat Khan hugged, and Pir Vilayat looked at Zalman in the eye and exclaimed, "Mushtu," which means you are drunk, but in a good way. Drunk with the spirit of God, intoxicated high, is what he meant. It was a Sufi compliment. Zalman stayed in touch with Pir Vilayat. He wrote, "I just fell in love with those kinds of human beings that they were. Still to this day, I thrill to the music of the Sufi choir." Zalman was introduced to Sufi spiritual practices, including dancing, whirling, breathing exercises, chanting, and spiritual walking. By 1975, when Zalman was back in the Bay Area again, during another break in his career, he and Pir Vilayat were ready to embrace one another at an even deeper level. At another Holy Man Jam event, Pir Vilayat initiated Zalman into his Sufi community as a sheikh, a spiritual master. However, Zalman made a point of becoming a Sufi while ceremonially robed as a Hasidic rabbi. Zalman was conscious that he was uniting with a universalist lineage of Sufis, so he was not required to accept Islamic doctrine or step out of his Jewish tradition as he did so, as Nathaniel just mentioned a few minutes ago. Their motto was, "Our Sufism is a religion of the heart. The most important thing is to seek God in the heart of humanity and not only in books and doctrine. Rumi was one of the great Sufi wisdom teachers in the same lineage as my father. 1968, the year of great changes. It was a transitional year when my father had a sabbatical and he spent it mostly in Boston. He transferred his graduate credits from Boston University and finally received a doctorate of Hebrew letters, DHL degree, at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio. It is a Reformed Jewish university with other campuses in Manhattan, Los Angeles, and Jerusalem, quite different from the traditional Orthodox Chabad movement, and more open to modern science, psychology, and social trends. While on sabbatical, my father also accepted the invitation of the Jews in Boston to help found a Chavurah, a small cooperative congregation in Somerville near the Harvard and Boston University campuses. Zalman's good friend, Rabbi Arthur Green, was their local leader. It was called Chavurat Shalom and was conceived as an experimental renewal community for Jews, embracing the open spiritual practice that Zalman had been writing about and embodying. It was a group of liberal thinkers ripe for change and relevance. Chavurat Shalom defines itself as a small, pioneering, egalitarian Jewish community where people come to pray, celebrate, and grapple with Jewish texts and traditions and work for social justice. We welcome people of all colors, ethnic backgrounds, disabilities, genders, and sexualities. We invite everyone. They kept many traditional Jewish spiritual practices and festivals, but left others behind, and the community is still active today. 1968 was also the year that my parents divorced, quite a turning point for our family. For years, my mother had tried hard to go along with my father as he was transforming from the Chabad tradition to his new, open Jewish renewal stance. But she could only go so far with him with good conscience. In 1968 was the point that she could not go anymore. I'd like to think of it in this way. I see it as my parents starting their marriage in black and white. But then my father's colors came out in the 1960s, while my mother remained black and white. It is what each of them needed in their lives, to be authentic to themselves, and they both were just that. So my mother became a single Jewish mom before the term was even coined. After they separated, we kids who were still minors lived with her, and she worked to help support us through school. She was a librarian at the Jewish school. She taught Hebrew classes. She worked at the Yiddish press. And eventually, she bought the Eli shop on McGregor and ran a food service business with kosher groceries, takeout food, and a sit-down cafe. Within the same momentous year, 1968-1969, following my father's sabbatical and his doctoral degree, following the founding of the Chavurat Shalom and my parents' divorce, Reb Zalman also founded the global Pnei Or Fellowship, which is known today as Aleph, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal. Reb Zalman launched Aleph with a small circle of his students and friends from Winnipeg, Boston, New York, and California, who wished to form an intentional spiritual community along the lines he'd been teaching and exemplifying. They did not see themselves as a separate Jewish denomination, and still don't. Their image is that they want to be a force for relevant change within the larger Jewish community without clear boundaries. The original name, B'nai Or, means sons of light, a title Reb Zalman took from the Dead Sea Scrolls that had just recently been discovered. The rainbow prayer shawl became their trademark. The group later changed its name for a while to the more gender-neutral Pnei Or, which means faces of light. And it continues today under the name of Aleph, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Other rabbis have since been ordained into Aleph, including my brother, Rabbi Shalom Schachter of Toronto. And so in 1969, we might say that Zalman was effectively also divorced from the Lubavitcher movement. But he continued his life's work as an independent post-denominational chassid, teaching the experiential dimensions of Hasidim as one of the world's great spiritual traditions. He later moved from Winnipeg in 1975, accepting an appointment as professor of Jewish mysticism and psychology of religion at Temple University in Philadelphia, marking another dramatic turning point in his life. So it's with the transitional year of 1968-1969 that we close the second episode of Reb Zalman's life story for today. We will continue in episode number 3 in November, looking at the triumphant final chapters of my father's life. That's when my father assumed a new name for himself, Zalman Schachter Shalomi. He also continued his growth as a universal spiritual practitioner. His circle of holy friends grew larger and larger. He came to be seen as a leading voice in a renewed Judaism and was called upon for conferences and interfaith dialogue globally, including by the Dalai Lama of Tibet. And then, at another momentous turning point in his life, my father embraced his own aging process with a pilgrimage into the wilderness of New Mexico and the founding of our Saging Movement for Conscious Spiritual Eldering. We'll see you again for the rest of the story in November.
Well, that brings us to the end of the story for episode 2. Now I'd like to ask you, Rabbi Orr, if you could speak on the experiences that Reb Zalman had in his middle years that affected and transformed him to the point of creating Jewish renewal and saging.
Thank you so much for the beautiful work that you've done. It really is a gift to all of us, Chana, Tina. There's so much to say because this period in your father's life was so rich. Let me start by saying that in some ways, I think Reb Zalman was prepared in part for this segment of his journey because as a child, his parents, your grandparents, made the decision to educate him both in religious and secular contexts. And in his memoir, he quips, he jokes that it made him feel a little dizzy because he was moving between worlds, as it were, in Vienna and onward. But as he reflected on his life as a child and an adolescent, he realized that it did prepare him to be the kind of bridge builder that he became later in life. I also want to say that your father was such a positive, forward-looking person that in my many interactions with him, he rarely spoke about the pain and suffering as a refugee that he and his family experienced. He was so much more invested in the project of renewal. And in one of the last conversations I had with him, he said to me that he realized as he was discerning what his work could be in the world, that it was about the upbuilding of Yiddishkeit, of Judaism in North America. And part of that, of course, was influenced by his time as a Chabad student and rabbi, because both the 6th and the 7th Rebbes of Chabad were thoroughly engaged in the project of the upbuilding of Jewish life in North America and then globally. But I think it's also important to remember that pain and suffering because your father carried it with him. And he realized just how much was lost, and that lineages, traditions, communities, families were broken in so many ways. And he really was a person dedicated to tikkun, to healing and mending. And of course, in his own travels, his wanderings and wonderings, part of what he discovered in North America is that in his service of God and the Jewish people, in his avodah, as it's called in Hebrew, that there were many more resources than he thought earlier in life. And so as a young Chabadnik, he was both excited and disoriented at first by discovering the spiritual riches in other religious traditions. And I think that because of his steadfast dedication to being in intimate relationship with God and the integrity of the spiritual search, both for himself and for others, he felt compelled to explore those other traditions. And as he met individuals, people like Howard Thurman and Thomas Merton, again, he felt like he had no choice but to pay careful attention to their wisdom, to their compassion, to their insight. And as he later said, meeting people like those two individuals and several others from different walks of spiritual and secular life caused him to redraw his reality map. He could no longer maintain, as he called it, a triumphalist perspective on Judaism and its relationship to other religious and cultural traditions. And that took great bravery. Again, think about his positionality. On the one hand, he felt that he was responsible to share with people all that was and could be beautiful about Judaism. And on the other hand, he also said, look to your left, look to your right, see, taste, touch, feel the presence of the divine coursing through all of life. That is not a simple thing to do. That is a complicated dance. To hold both one's commitment to their particular tradition and to universal truths that he was discovering. And he was rare in that regard. He really was on the growing edge, as he liked to say. That was one of the terms that he loved from his mentor, Howard Thurman. And again, I want to say that there were times in his life, of course, where that kind of weaving led him to feel alone, to feel isolated, to feel unseen or unappreciated, because many people were just not capable of holding the tension of the particular and the universal. And he himself in this period, of course, as he later reflected, was moving one step at a time. He didn't yet have a grand vision in mind. He wasn't the Reb Zalman of The Jew in the Lotus, or the Reb Zalman who became the World Wisdom Chair at Naropa University in Boulder. As he said, these insights were coming to him piecemeal. And I think that's important for the rest of us to remember, because we can look at great figures like Reb Zalman or Thurman or Merton and say, they had it all figured out. But that was not the case at all. And you know that, because this period of his life was both very exciting and tumultuous in terms of his marriage, his family, his professional aspirations, his relationship to the Chabad community, to the Orthodox community. By the way, one of the things that I think is important to understand too is that in his journey from what he described as restoration to renewal, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the discovery of non-Orthodox Jewish teachers, movements, ideas were also new and fresh to him in certain ways. And he was allowing himself to be open to those differently, as he was also opening himself to non-Jewish spiritual traditions. That is to say, it was a period of intense exploration. And there were times, he said to me, where it was actually more difficult to open himself and to really listen and learn from non-Orthodox Jews and Jewish traditions than it was from non-Jewish traditions. In fact, I would say that the Reverend Howard Thurman, the great African-American spiritual master whom he encountered in 1955 at Boston University, was probably the first non-Orthodox religious teacher of any tradition that compelled your father to listen and learn. He simply could not ignore the kindness, the wisdom, the courage of Thurman. And that helped him in part to investigate the riches in non-Hasidic religious traditions, non-Orthodox traditions, etc. And again, that takes great courage and can leave one feeling very vulnerable and lonely. And we should not forget that, because so much of your father's legacy today has actually been integrated into Jewish life across denominations and far beyond. But when, for example, he started to experiment with setting Jewish prayers to American folk music and translating those Hebrew words into English, it was not popular. It certainly was not the norm. And some people looked and listened and said, this is interesting. This is sweet. This is cute. Some even said, this is profound. But others said, this is strange. This is silly. This is unbecoming. And he did not let that stop him. The other thing to say is that in these years and onward, your father invested in friendships and relationships with students, and that was very significant to his growth. I think that he understood that he was an oddball in different ways, and that opened him to spending time with people outside of the range of usual companions, friends, colleagues, including, again, younger people throughout the rest of his life who challenged him on issues, including women at different points who challenged him about issues of patriarchy, misogyny, hierarchy. And I think he took seriously, with bumps and bruises along the way, the Hasidic teaching based on various passages from the Hebrew Bible, from the Tanakh, about remaining fresh, remaining open, really committing to the process of renewal. Because when he first came to the United States, he said later in life, he really thought his avodah, his service to God and to the Jewish people, was to restore as much as possible that was lost during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, and to try and reestablish as much of Yiddishkeit from the old world as possible. But over the course of 15 to 25 years, he shifted and became a renewalist. And that was his mission as he saw it for the rest of his life. And again, it wasn't simple or easy or smooth. It was circuitous at times. It was painful at times. It was lonely at times. It was confusing at times. And thank God he had the blessing of longevity and psycho-spiritual insight as an elder to really look back with honesty and to assess the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I saw him firsthand, both publicly and privately, engage in a process of tshuva, of return, of repair, of what we commonly call repentance, because he knew that he had made mistakes along the way. He was aware that he had made major contributions to Jewish and interreligious life. But he also understood that if he was going to embrace his role as a sage later in life, that it required an honest process of what the Hasidim call berur, discernment, doing a life review. And I think that's a very important model for us and something to acknowledge here as we're actually exploring the middle years, not the later years. Long before he was the celebrated globe-trotting wise man, because he grew into that. And that takes time. I'll share one personal anecdote related to this, Chana, which you won't be surprised by, and I may have, in fact, shared it with you before. But as children, my older brothers and I, living in Winnipeg, on the edges of different Jewish and interreligious communities, had a battle cry, which was, why can't we just be normal? And that had everything to do with my parents' choices to be a part of what your father described as the creation of a Jewish spiritual community for left-footed people. And they refused, simply to go with the flow, even if that was easier or more convenient or less confusing to them and to their children. And thank God that we had other companions and teachers. And your father was absolutely a teacher and a mentor to my parents, but also a friend. And he allowed himself to be those things. And they insisted that he be all of those. And so I benefited from this exploratory, creative, eclectic, idiosyncratic way of being in the world before I was a twinkle in my parents' eyes. And as you know, your dad was my sandik, which means that he held me as I was born into, welcomed into, ushered into the covenant of the Jewish people. And then he gave me my first talit, my first prayer shawl, and of course, it was a rainbow talis. And then he was one of the rabbis that ordained me. And so I am honored to be a part of this conversation, to be in dialogue with you, to be reflecting together on the unusual journey that your father took, both the glorious elements of it and the painful pieces. And again, I just want to thank you for bringing parts of this story that were unknown to so many into this community, not only so that we understand the fuller picture with greater depth of your father's journey, emergence, and blossoming, but also so that we can learn from it. And again, I think your dad always was thinking about past and present, but also future. What can we do next? What is God calling us to do and to be? So again, Yishar Kochech, thank you. May you go from strength to strength to continue this project and continue your own beautiful growth process. I'm humbled and honored to be here with you and on the journey together.
Thank you so much, Or, from the bottom of my heart. That was really beautiful. And I really loved how you and your brothers said, why can't we be normal? I think that we also felt that we weren't normal as kids. But you know what? Not being normal leads you to growing up and becoming unique and very special. So thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And please tune in for episode number 3 that is going to come in November. And it's the final presentation in this series on the major turning points in Reb Zalman's life that led him to Jewish renewal and into saging. And I, too, hope to be a bridge builder between different groups and to be able to share my father's stories with everyone. So thank you so much, and l'chaim, to life.
la 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 la